John Marie Vianney was born on April 8, 1786, and was the fourth child of 6 children. He grew up on a farm in a happy and loving household with 2 devout parents. When John was 7, he and his little sister would watch the sheep. Those were good times, and John loved being a shepherd. They would play games with the other shepherd children, or sometimes sit in the grass and knit socks. John grew up during the French Revolution. Priests were martyred, and some went into hiding, disguised as shopkeepers and farmers, and late at night the family would attend Mass in secret and go to confession. John was so inspired, he pretended to be a priest and said Mass in the fields, and his sister and the neighborhood kids would act as his congregation. Then they would process to the little statue of the Blessed Mother that he made out of mud and clay to say the Rosary. Because of the French Revolution, John wasn't prepared to receive Holy Communion and didn't receive it until he was 13 years old. In 1802, Catholics were finally able to practice their faith freely again. Because the French Revolution killed so many priests, there was a shortage, and for this reason, a priest, Father Bailey, was offering free classes in Écully, a suburb of Lyon. John was interested, but he faced many obstacles immediately. One was his father, who thought it would be impossible for him to become a priest since they didn't have the money to send him to the seminary, and John didn't have enough education. But John's mother supported him, believing he had a vocation, and eventually his father did give in. But then John got word that Father Bailey didn't think John had a vocation to the priesthood. Again, John's mother intervened and arranged for the two to meet, and after talking with John for a while, Father Bailey accepted him into his little school. John moved in with his Aunt Marguerite, and he attended classes during the day. He was 19 years old at the time, and his classmates were around 12 to 14 years old. It was humiliating enough that he was the oldest, but even worse, he was the slowest of the class. Years of not being able to attend school due to the revolution left him very behind, and he lacked the skills to study. He also had difficulty retaining information. Latin was the hardest for him. A fellow student, a 12-year-old, was kind enough to tutor John, and it did help a little bit. John knew that, to others, it didn't make sense for him to be a priest when it called for so much education, but Father Bailey encouraged John to rely on God. When he was younger, he was moved from watching the flocks to helping his older brother Francis in the fields, which he found exhausting. No matter how hard John worked, he couldn't keep up with Francis and was always falling behind. But one day he had the inspiration to bring a small statue of the Blessed Virgin with him to the fields. He would say a prayer, kiss her feet, and then throw the statue as far as he could. Then he would pick up his hoe and clear the weeds as fast as he could to reach the statue. He would then repeat the whole process again, and soon John was outworking his older brother. In much the same way, this was how John worked on his studies, not relying on himself, but on God's strength to get him through. Father Bailey encouraged John to add sacrifice to his prayers, saying it made them more powerful because love and sacrifice were attached to them. So John took a break from his studies to go on a pilgrimage in hopes of understanding Latin better. The work did get a little easier, although John still struggled. Unfortunately, John's learning came to an abrupt halt when he was drafted to fight in the war. Father Bailey intervened, arguing that priests and seminarians were supposed to be exempt from being drafted. But the government argued back, saying that since John wasn't in a formal seminary and lived with his aunt instead, and the fact that the classes were mainly for 13 and 14-year-old kids, that he could be drafted. Everyone felt it was very unfair, but John knew that he didn't have a choice. Apparently, God wanted him to be a soldier instead of a priest. But when John boarded the train to report for duty on the scheduled day, he became very sick and was hospitalized for 6 weeks. When he was well enough to leave the hospital, he was told to meet with the captain to join his detachment, which would depart for Spain on January 6th. John promised he wouldn't be late, and on his way stopped at a church to pray for protection and God's leading. What he thought was only a few minutes in prayer turned out to be hours, and to his horror, he realized he had missed his appointment with the captain. The captain was not pleased and told him to catch up with the troops who were miles ahead of him in Renison. John was still weak from his illness and needed to stop to find a place to rest for the night, and sat under a tree and began to pray the Rosary. A man coming through the woods spotted John and asked him what he was doing. When John explained the situation to him, the man told John that he could give him a place to stay for the night. Then he took John's bag, and John had no choice but to follow him. The man brought him to a small village named Leno and convinced John to stay with them until the war ended. John had unwittingly become a deserter of the war, and if found, he would be caught and put to death. John was hesitant, but in the end agreed to stay with the man's cousin and her family and help around the farm as well as catechizing the children. The woman's name was Claudine Vianney, and she and her children learned to love John, accepting him as part of their family. They even came up with a name for him for safety reasons and called him Cousin Jerome. They also came up with a signal to warn him if the police were coming to look for deserters. Only once they did come, and John hid in a large mound of hay. He stayed with the family for 18 months, and when he got word that his brother back in Dardilly had enlisted in the army, this meant that John was now able to return home since his brother had taken his place. Not only that, but France was now at peace, and all deserters were given a general pardon. With great joy, John began to pack his bags, but seeing how much the Fayette family had come to rely on John's help, he stayed to help through the harvest and left in January. His family was thrilled to see John again, but sadly, 2 weeks after his arrival, his mother died. She had been his biggest supporter in everything, and her death was a tremendous loss to him. Father Bailey was especially thrilled that John was back and urged him to return to his studies. This time, he had John stay with him rather than his aunt, giving John a closer personal view of a priest's life. In 1812, he entered the minor seminary, and once again he struggled in his studies and was placed in a small group with 7 other seminarians who also struggled with philosophy and Latin. He scraped by in his studies, and in 1813, he entered the major seminary. Here, it was even harder for John, as there is no help for students who are expected to know Latin and philosophy by now. A teacher and a fellow seminarian volunteered to tutor him, but despite their help, 6 months later, John was told he didn't have a vocation to the priesthood and that he should just go home. John didn't even argue. Instead, he decided he should be a brother, because brothers didn't need a special education and they didn't need to learn Latin. However, Father Bailey was convinced that John did have a vocation and that the devil was behind all the discouragements and failings. He told John that he would teach him everything taught at the major seminary, and that when it was time for the exam, he would return to take them. For 3 months, he and John worked hard, but when it was time for the examinations, John failed. Once again, John felt that this was a sign that he should not be a priest, but Father Bailey talked to the vicar general, explaining that he believed John had a vocation, and to give John the examination again in his own home where he felt more comfortable. The vicar general reluctantly agreed, and after interviewing and quizzing John in the rectory, he too was convinced that John had a vocation, and he was allowed to move on to the minor orders. Finally, thanks to his mother's prayers from heaven and to Father Bailey's persistence, things were falling into place, and on July 2nd, through a special dispensation, he received the 4 minor orders and was ordained a subdeacon. It was decided, since Father Bailey had done such a good job training John, that he would continue to learn his studies from him rather than return to the major seminary. They studied for months, and finally, on August 13, 1815, at the age of 29, John was finally ordained a priest. However, there was one disappointment. Because John didn't have enough study hours in philosophy, he wasn't allowed to hear confessions. This was a bitter blow for him. But John decided if he couldn't be a learned priest, then he would become a holy one. Happily, he was selected to be Father Bailey's assistant. He helped with baptisms and said a few masses, but since he wasn't able to hear confession, it made things very awkward for him when family and friends would ask him to hear their confession, and he had to say no. But Father Bailey continued to have John study, and soon he had accumulated enough hours that the vicar general said John could hear confessions. John was beside himself with joy, and Father Bailey was his first penitent. Father Bailey died on December 17, 1817, and John was devastated to lose his friend and mentor. Secretly, he hoped that he would be the parish priest of his hometown, or even for Leno, where his second family was. But instead, John was sent to a small town named Ars, with a population of 215. It was described as a small poor town that doesn't love much. John found this to be true and discovered a run-down church that very few people attended. The townspeople stayed up late at night, drinking and gambling at the taverns, and the young people danced at barn dances, dancing inappropriately that led to acts of impurity. Even the children cursed. There was no observance of resting on Sundays. Everyone worked in the fields, and on the days they should have been working, they loitered about, ignoring their duties. At first, John couldn't help but be shocked, but then he decided it was probably due to the revolution that people were so ignorant. For the first few Sundays, as he preached against the drinking, dancing, wearing, and working on Sundays, he made more enemies than friends. Soon, angry letters began to be sent to John. Then, they were sent to the bishop. John was certain the bishop would have him removed. But then John remembered what his good friend Father Bailey had said about prayer without suffering is a weak prayer. So John began to fast every day for the people of the town, eating only boiled potatoes. When the bishop sent a witness to meet with John, it was reported that John was a good priest and that he could stay. Encouraged that God wanted him there, John also gave up hours of sleep to pray. This, in addition to the fasting, began to change the town. He started a daily catechism class for children, and at the same time taught them to honor God's name, and this began to trickle down to the parents. Very slowly, more people began to attend Mass. 2 years after he arrived, thanks to the wealthier people who supported John's ambition, the church was much improved with a new roof, as well as 2 new chapels added to the church, one for the Blessed Virgin and one to St. Joseph. In 1820, the Vicar General decided to send John to Sal, saying it would be better for his health. But John felt that in reality it was because he failed in Ars, but he obediently left for Sal. However, when he reached the river, he found it was too flooded to cross safely. He decided to return to Ars to spend the night, and when he got back, he was surprised to hear that his supporters and friends had petitioned the Vicar General to allow John to stay. John was touched by their support and renewed his efforts to win over the town. Things were going well until 1823, when John decided to open a school for girls to learn reading, writing, as well as sewing and cooking. He planned to use the money left over from his father's inheritance, who had died a few years earlier, to buy a large house and turn it into a boarding school. This school would be free, and therefore named Providence, as they would rely on God for everything. He sent 2 willing women, Catherine and Benedicta, off for training to be teachers, and in the meantime bought the house. However, many townspeople opposed this, and he began again receiving threatening letters. "You were asked to leave the major seminary because you couldn't learn Latin," stated one letter. "Now you dare to think of starting a school." It was upsetting so many people that John almost stopped the project, but then realized that all his misery was from not loving crosses and trying to run away. He then set about praying for the grace for love of suffering. After that, everything became easy. The bishop approved the plan of the school, and it was opened in 1824. Soon they had 16 boarders. John had another problem: rats, or so he thought. Every time he went to bed, he would hear the scampering of feet, sometimes quite big feet, running around his room and under his bed. In the morning, he would find his bed linen chewed through. At night, John would get up with a pitchfork looking for the rats, but was never able to find them. Soon the scampering of rat feet turned into bigger noises. Doorknobs would rattle, and loud crashes in the next room were heard. Thinking that it was robbers trying to steal his Mass vestments, he asked a young man to stay with him in the rectory. The young man stayed with him for one night and said he would never stay again. "I think your house is haunted, Father," he told him with wide eyes. John was still convinced it had to be robbers, so the next night another young man stayed with him. This time, as they both listened to the sounds around the house, it suddenly tilted and shook, throwing both men off their feet. Thinking it was an earthquake, they rushed to the window expecting to see the town awake, but no one else was disturbed. Eventually, John accepted that all the disturbances were from the devil. He wrote, "As soon as I got into bed, the nerve-wracking noises would begin. First, the devil would patter around my room like a big dog, sniffing and whining, or he might change himself into a cloud of bats and cluster upon the bed curtains close to my face. Again, he might make a noise like a herd of sheep in the room just overhead, or hide himself in the chimney and squeak like a bird. Sometimes it seemed that in the room below, he even turned himself into a giant horse, leaped to the ceiling, then dropped to the floor with an immense clatter of his iron shoes. Or he might move the furniture about. And this would go on for the next 30 years. However, John noticed one thing. These disturbances would come right before someone made a big confession. And this would make John very happy. He would say to himself, "Tomorrow a big sinner is coming." John was occasionally asked to hear confessions in the neighboring towns, and soon he began to notice some of the penitents in his confessional lines in Ars. One time, while he was hearing confession in Trevoux, the line was so long that people grew impatient and began pushing, which nearly turned the confessional over. John got out of the confessional and told the crowds that he wouldn't leave until he heard everyone's confession. But then one day, something extraordinary happened that would bring even more pilgrims to Ars. In 1829, they had 30 boarders, and being a free school, they ran out of bread. Hearing about this, John put a relic of his favorite saint, St. John Francis, in the storeroom where the wheat was kept, and then prayed. When his helper Catherine went to the storeroom to see if there was any grain, she expected to see the bare shelves that she had seen just earlier. But upon opening the door, she was astounded when a multiplication of grain poured over her feet and down the hall. Upon hearing of this miracle, John held a mass of thanksgiving to St. John Francis, but people instead attributed it to John, and soon people from all over were coming to Ars, seeking miracles and healing. John had a special devotion to St. Philomena, and after she had appeared to him when he was very sick and near death one day, he encouraged people to pray to her for miracles and cures. In fact, he even had another shrine added to the church, dedicated to St. Philomena in 1837. He told Catherine that he made a deal with St. Philomena that he would have people pray for their cures in front of her relic if she cured them. She agreed to this, but instead of diverting the attention from himself to Philomena, as he hoped, everyone was even more convinced that he was the source of the miracles, since it was happening upon his suggestion to pray to her. John then asked Philomena to wait to cure the people until they reached their own home, but this didn't work either. John was often tempted to leave Ars, fearing for the sanctity of his soul. Since he spent all his time in the confessional, he felt he didn't have enough time to pray. This was another temptation from the devil which John didn't recognize right away. After his illness, he saw how well the city of Ars was doing and decided that it was time for him to become a monk and pray for his own soul. He wrote to the bishop for permission to visit his brother and permission to become a monk. But when the townspeople learned that John was leaving, they begged him to stay. He managed to leave anyway, convinced that this was the will of God. He stayed with his brother and his sister-in-law, but during this visit, he began receiving letters from the people of Ars about how much people were suffering and how they didn't like the new priest and therefore was no longer attending Mass. Then pilgrims managed to track him down, begging for blessings, healings, and confession. They loitered about the front yard and peeked through the windows. Last, he received word from the bishop that he could not become a brother, but if he wanted, there was need for a chaplain in Beaumont. John prayed much about this and offered a mass for clarification, and God let him know that he should stay in Ars. He was quite remorseful and very relieved that the people of Ars welcomed him back so readily. He promised to never leave again, but he did a few years later, again tempted by the devil to put more importance on solitude and prayer for his soul. John's humility made him worry about his pride and how people treated him as a saint and wonder worker, and it didn't help that now God had given him the gift of reading soul. Now he was hearing 100 to 200 confessions a day, spending up to 18 hours in the confessional. He was old now, and the constant confusion of people and strain of staying in the hot confessional day after day wore him out. But he was now convinced that God did want him to serve the people of Ars, as well as the pilgrims, and once again he renewed his commitment to stay, even if his soul craved solitude and silence. When a letter arrived from the Marist fathers, inviting him to live in their house of recollection at La Nière, John forgot about his promise to stay in Ars, and took the invitation as his permission from God to finally become a brother. But as he tried to sneak away in the middle of the night, the entire town was there to meet him, begging him to stay. When he insisted he must leave, they tried to go with him. When this didn't work, they took his breviary away, knowing he wouldn't leave without it. He went to the rectory to get another one, and in the meantime, someone began to ring the church bell, a signal for the town that something big was happening. When he stepped out of the rectory to leave, he was astounded to find not only the townspeople, but all who lived in the country and the pilgrims standing in groups with pitchforks and clubs. Hearing the clanging of the bell, they thought perhaps there was an emergency. Maybe someone had broken into the church, or perhaps there was a fire. Desperate to escape the chaos, John locked himself inside the church. There he prayed again for God's will, and once again he was told that he must stay, and furthermore, that he should not worry about his sanctity or his prayers. He would attain perfection by being a devoted pastor, meeting with people, advising and encouraging them, and absolving them from their sins. And so he stayed in Ars for the rest of his years, although now he was in his 70s, and people did come. It was estimated that at least 20,000 pilgrims visited Ars each year. Cures and conversions continued to happen, as well as miracles and spiritual healings. John dutifully stayed in the confessional, sometimes consoling, and at other times revealing hidden sins that needed to be confessed. A famous story tells of a woman who tried to speak to Father John about her husband who had committed suicide. She was in constant anguish over his soul, but because of the long lines, she was unable to talk to him. She was ready to give up and go home when Father John saw her through the lines and called to her. "He is saved. He is in purgatory, and you must pray for him." Between the parapet of the bridge and the water, he had time to make an act of contrition, but he is saved. The town of Ars had John Vianney until his death at 73 years old. When they heard of his sickness and that he probably wouldn't recover this time, they gathered in the St. Philomena chapel as they had before, praying for a miracle. But he told them that this time it wouldn't happen. John would finally be able to leave Ars, and no one could stop him. But for the love of his people, he asked that his body be buried in Ars. John died August 4th, 1859, at 73 years old from extreme exhaustion and suffering from a high fever for 3 days. Thousands of people came to his funeral, and he was canonized May 31st, 1925. Today his body lies encased in wax, and his heart that suffered and worked for his people is incorrupt.